Welkom everyone. Iedereen welkom op dit middaggesprek. Zoals u weet, in het Hollands College Metaforum heeft hier ook regelmatig bijeenkomsten van LIAS. LIAS is het Leuven Institute of Advanced Study. En wij houden bijeenkomsten met internationale fellows. En er is een fellow-bijeenkomst aan de gang en dat gaat over voedselsysteem, duurzame voedselsysteem. Dus hoe zullen we in de toekomst kunnen voor voldoende voedsel zorgen, gegeven de constraints of de climate change en biodiversiteit en dergelijke. Het zijn al hele interessante discussies geweest over het gebruik van pesticiden, over de vraag of landbouw kan gecombineerd worden met biodiversiteit, of het areaal kan verminderd worden, of alternatieve vormen van landbouw eventueel een mogelijke alternatieve piste zijn. Al die zaken zijn eigenlijk al heel besproken. Omdat er sommige mensen van die fellows nu hier aanwezig zijn en geen Nederlands kennen, will I change now in English, so the debate will be in English. So today we all know that the population is growing slowly. It is not anymore that kind of apocalyptic idea that the world will, with too many people, in a lot of regions the population is already diminishing, but Africa is still a continent where a lot of people, young people are there, and the growth of the population is still high. And the question is, can Africa be fed? How is the agriculture environment, and how can that be done? So this is the subject of, and it fits nicely in the program of LIAS. Martin van Ittersum will introduce this team and explain how the prospects are for Sub-Saharan Africa. And then Koen Dekeyser will react. Martin is from the University of Wageningen, and Koen is a member of a think tank which is indeed busy with sustainable food systems for Europe and for Africa. I give the floor to Martin.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope everybody can hear me well. Yeah? I think there's no perfect place here in this room to stand as a speaker, but I hope in this way everybody can see the screen fairly well. Maybe for the people there, if you could move, yeah. And for those who can see me and may start to wonder what did this person do in the nightlife of Leuven or Wageningen, nothing exciting like this. I fell with my bike earlier this week, and that's why I look a little bit ugly for people who can see me. But so no exciting stories to tell about Leuven nightlife or Wageningen nightlife. The topic was introduced, so I'll take it away. And indeed, population increase, we're all familiar with the numbers. The population is expected to increase from 8 to close to 10 in 2050, and increase a bit more to close to 11 end of this century. But that's a global number that doesn't say that much about where the problems may occur. And from this graph, it's immediately clear the yellow color and the blue colors, Asia and Africa, that's where the population will grow, not in the rest of the world, and certainly not if you look at relative numbers. What is also evident is that the yellow color, Asia, that will peak rather soon in this century. 2050, 2060 or so, the population will not further increase in that part of the world. But in the blue color, you can see in Africa, it will continue to increase, maybe even until the end of this century. That's one trend that we have to take into account. The other one is what we eat. We have lunch now, and if we look at a number of calories that you consume as a person per day, and that's on the y-axis, and on the x-axis what the average income is of a person, then there's a quite strong relationship between the two. And this is an older graph, but it still holds, from David Tillman, and it also shows in the different colors the average income in different countries in the world. And in the lower left corner, let's say the purple color, that's the African countries, the poorest countries on the planet. Also some Asian countries, but mostly in Africa. And the red color, so there on the right upper end, that's, let's say, Belgium, the Netherlands, etc., the richer countries. And I think it's immediately clear these African countries will move along the curve. The incomes will increase, they do increase already, so their diets will start to change. They will consume more calories per person per day, and that will have influences on what the demand will be. Now, there's much more to tell about this graph, but I won't do that. That's the consumption side. So, important to keep in mind, it's very region specific. Production, same story, very region specific. If you look back in the past 60 years in my life and much of your life, this is a graph showing the maize yields per hectare and how they have developed in 60 years' time. And the different colors, different continents. Gray color is North Africa, North America. Not a small difference. North America. Green is Europe, and red at the lower end, that's Sub-Saharan Africa. And you see how yield changes differ between different continents, and they're really slow in Africa. Just about 2 tons per hectare at the moment of maize. That's what we achieve. Very interesting, the right graph, that shows how, let's say, different continents on our planet have increased production in the past 60 years. The same colors, and you can see, and yeah, it's a bit complicated maybe, but we put the numbers, the area and the yields of 1960 at 100%. So 1960 is 100%. And then we follow the relative change in the 60 years that follow. And then on the y-axis is the relative change in yields, and on the x-axis the relative change in area. And then you can immediately see 2 extremes. On the vertical axis, or a bit left even, it's not straight up, but it's a bit to the left. So the area has been decreasing compared to 1960 in Europe and in North America, and the yields have increased more than 3-fold in some cases. So 300%, more than 300% the yields now compared to 1960. But the other extreme again is Africa, which is, the line is almost horizontal. Area expansion has been the dominant way in which production has been increased. More than a doubling of the area, more than 200% compared to 1960. And the yields, yeah, they have increased, but slowly. And that was already evident from that graph. So Africa is basically, not entirely the only, but it's the continent where area expansion is the dominant way of increasing production. And the yields are really increasing very slowly. So if we talk about food demand increase for the world, and some predict around 50% between, let's say, that's already a bit earlier, so it's not today, but 2015 or so, and then 2050, 50% increase in food demand. That's a global number. It's not very meaningful from my point of view, because you have to differentiate between different regions. And the 2 extremes basically are Africa, where the demand will increase fastest because of population growth and because the current diets are so poor, if you want, low calorie intake and low diversity intake as well. So there the production focus and availability focus is really justified. The other extreme is Europe, where the population is stabilizing, maybe even decreasing. We're aging, we are eating already too much, and certainly of certain products, so our diets have to change. So the focus on consumption, healthy nutrition and environment, that's what we can afford in this part of the world. And that's basically also the topic of the LIAS meeting that we're enjoying these 3 weeks, and that was introduced by the chairman. So I will focus on Africa for the rest of this lunchgesprek. I'll present a study that we published just a few months ago, and that focused on 10 countries, 5 countries in West Africa, 5 in East Africa. They are mentioned here. These 10 countries represent more than half of the population in Sub-Saharan Africa. and even more than 60% of the arable area, arable cropland area of the entire subcontinent. And you can see if you take 61% over 54%, these countries are relatively land abundant. So they have a bit more cropland per person than average in the subcontinent. So the data that I will show will not be optimistic from that point of view. Sorry, they will be optimistic in the sense that they have more land per person available. The rest of Sub-Saharan Africa has less land per person available. I'll focus on the 5 main cereals: maize, millets, rice, sorghum, and wheat. In terms of area across the continent, these are the dominant ones. Together, they take about 50% of the cropland area. So half of the area of crops is taken by these 5 cereals. And also close to half of the calories and the proteins that people consume in the subcontinent. Much of my slides, I will aggregate the 5 cereals into what we call maize equivalents. So that makes it easier to show everything in one graph. Otherwise, you would have to look at maize, at millet, at sorghum, and they are grown in different parts of the continent, etc. So I'll just put them together, although I realize from a nutrition point of view, you cannot readily do that always.
What is the meaning of millet?
Geest. Yeah, so maize equivalents for the sake of simplicity. And if we want to stop this expansion of agricultural area, as was the dominant pattern in Africa for 60 and maybe even more than that, but certainly the last 60 years, then we have to look at what we call yield gaps. So increasing the production on current areas. And I'll briefly explain it, and that's enough for the purpose of today. Farmers achieve certain yields on their cropland, and if you would compare what farmers achieve with their current management, and you would, let's say, optimize the management and do everything perfect, then you could achieve a potential yield. And if you compare the two, the yield potential with the actual farmer's yield, that's what we call the yield gap. And by improving the management of the farmer on the current area, we can close the yield gap to a yield potential. You can calculate the yield potential for irrigated conditions, so in conditions where water is available to also overcome the water deficit. But you can also calculate the yield gaps or the yield potential for rain-fed conditions where water for irrigation is not available. And that is the case in Sub-Saharan Africa. Basically, you could say all cereal production is rain-fed. So what I use in the rest of the talk is yield potential and yield gaps with the reference of rain-fed potential yields. So water is not optimized, but nutrients and crop protection against pests and diseases, that's what we assume to be optimized, or at least to some degree optimized, to close the yield gaps. Maybe some of you are familiar with a study that we did 10 years ago, and it's interesting to briefly show the results and how things have changed in 10 years' time. 10 years ago, we took 2010 as the reference year and looked ahead to 2050. And at that time, the expectation was that the demand for cereals in Sub-Saharan Africa would triple, close to triple. Mostly because of population increase to 2.3, and then on top of that more demand, so in total affected 2.8 demand increase. So we looked at the yield gaps at that moment, so and the maize yields that farmers achieved, or the millet yields, or the wheat yields, etc., that the farmers achieved, as a percentage of what is potentially possible. And we found at that time that the yield gap closure, so farmers' yield as a percentage of the potential, was around 20 to 30%. Red colors, you cannot read it probably, but here it's about 10, 20, 30% yield gap closure, and the green colors is 80 to 90% yield gap closure. Yeah? But you see no green colors here. The green colors you can find in Northwest Europe, in parts of North America. China is getting greener from that point of view, and yield gaps close to 70%, but not in Sub-Saharan Africa. And then in terms of self-sufficiency of that study 10 years ago, this is the summary. And basically what we concluded is that, and this is the self-sufficiency between 0 and 1 or 100% for these 5 cereals. Yeah. So feeding just as much is needed to consume for these 10 countries in West and East Africa. And we show the self-sufficiency levels for different yield increases on current area of 2010. The darkest color is no change in yields, so we take the 2010 yields and we assume that they are the same in 2050. Now, of course, that would be dramatic, and the self-sufficiency would only be 20–30% because of population increase, dietary change. Now, subsequently, we increase the yields, but the graph is showing that even if we would manage to close the yield gaps to 80% of the potential, so the green colors of Northwest Europe and parts of North America, self-sufficiency would only just, not quite, but close to be achieved. And I mean, we used careful words at that time, but I think the careful reader could conclude, well, this is very unlikely to happen. And to move within, say, 35–40 years from the red colors to the green colors, to have such a fast development in agriculture and yield development, that's hard to imagine that will occur in Africa. So that was 10 years ago. Let's look now what actually happened over the past 10 years, and then look again ahead to 2050. So this graph is summarizing in the light green color the data for 2010, and in the darker green color the data for 2020. And these are the actual data that we could find. West Africa, East and South Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, so the 10 countries together. And many graphs for the rest of the talk are like this. You don't have to look at the 10 countries individually. Let's look at the average, what the patterns for the continent. And what you can see then is that actually the situation in these 10 years has improved a little bit. The self-sufficiency is closer to 100%. It's now 92% or so for Sub-Saharan Africa. It used to be a bit above 80%. So despite a population increase of almost 30% in 10 years, imagine, 30% more people in 10 years' time, and also some dietary change, the subcontinent has become a little bit more self-sufficient, close to 100% actually. And we might discuss later, full self-sufficiency is not a necessary aim, I think. We are all familiar with trade, and trade can even be beneficial. But if you look at the large commodities, the main things that we eat and consume, larger regions in the world are to an important extent self-sufficient in these commodities because of, they want to be independent from the rest of the world, so they want to be independent from geopolitical tensions, and also you need a lot of credit, of course, and finances to import these amounts of food. So there are reasons why some degree of self-sufficiency is really a good thing, at least something that is ambitioned by regions. Now, the question, of course, is how come? What can explain these developments in these 10 years? And there are actually 3 main effects of these changes in the 10 years. In red, so it's again West Africa, East and South Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa. So we actually decompose the production increase in these 10 years to 3 factors. One is area expansion, 2 is yield increases, and 3 is changes in crops. So in red is the area expansion, so particularly in West Africa, almost half of the production increase between 2010 and 2020 could be attributed to area increase. So a further expansion of the area under cereals in West Africa. It also occurred in East and South Africa, but much less, as you can see. And in terms of percentages, roughly 10% area increase. So in 10 years, that's a lot. In green, that's yield increase, and that is the dominant thing in East and South Africa. So an increase in yields per hectare, that was the dominant factor that explains a better self-sufficiency in 2020 compared to 2010. And then another interesting one, the blue color, is the change in cropping patterns. And that is particularly important in West Africa. And I'll show you what happens. So these are the different cereals: rain-fed maize, rain-fed millet, rice, irrigated rice. That's the only irrigated wheat, cereal crop basically in Africa. Rain-fed sorghum, rain-fed wheat. And then West Africa and East and Southern Africa, and then 2010, 2020. And what you can see is that the share of maize increased in West Africa and that of millet decreased. So maize is substituting millet to quite a large extent in West Africa, and maize is much more productive, at least under the right climate conditions. So that explains why the situation also improved in West Africa. It's not only area expansion, yield increases, but also a change from millet to maize as the main shift. That's much less happening in East and Southern Africa. Millet is grown less. We can discuss why and how. Yield changes were important in these 10 years, and particularly recently the red color is showing the yield increase, the average yield increase in Eastern Africa. So now it's about 50 kilograms per hectare per year on an average, but there is a huge variation again if you look at the different countries. And that's, here I took some countries: Ethiopia, Mali, Nigeria and Tanzania, and you see Tanzania is basically a horizontal or even slightly negative line. Yields do not change for maize in this case, whereas the steepest one and by far the most positive trend can be found in Ethiopia, where the maize yields and other yields have been increasing quite steeply. But I wonder what is happening right now with the civil war, and you see already some stagnation over the most recent years. Look here. And, there's no further increase, perhaps. So let's see what will happen in the years ahead. Okay, let's then come to the next point, and that is looking ahead. So we explained what happened between 2010 and 2020. Let's now look to 2050 again and see what has changed compared to 10 years ago. This is the population data that we used. In 2010, it was around, in the 10 countries, 500 million people, and it grew by 29% until 2020. And if we look ahead, we expect another 75% more people in these 10 countries compared to 2020, and plus 75%. So in the 10 countries only, 1 billion people in these 10 countries, with Nigeria being by far the largest, 370 million people, the third country on our planet in terms of population by 2050. And it's worth spending 1 minute on these population data, because it's one reason why, and I can already say that, it's a bit of a spoiler, but why the conclusions of our study are a bit more optimistic or less pessimistic than they were 10 years ago. These population projections are a little bit less pessimistic than they used to be. Here I compared 3 sources, or yeah, you could say sources of population projections. The data we took was here for one of the shared socioeconomic pathways, the scenario, well-used scenario for future studies. So these data we used. The second column is the projection from the United Nations, but that's from 10 years ago. So that forecasts quite a bit a higher population, close to 1.2 billion people rather than 1 billion people that we used. And if you look at the latest United Nations projections, they say it's about 1.1 billion people. So we're talking about differences of 100 million people. It's not a minor thing. So, and you may have read an article in The Economist of 2 years ago, the world's peak population may be smaller than expected. That's what you indeed see back in these data. So this graph is summarizing what we assumed in our study in terms of demand. So this population increase of 75% between 2020 and 2050. And on top of that, some dietary change, consuming more per person. Also thanks to livestock production that consumes cereals. So in total, we assumed roughly a doubling of the demand between 2020 and 2050, factor 2. Mostly because of more people, partly also because of consuming more per person. Right, let's then come to the results for 2020 and then compared with 2050. This is showing the self-sufficiency for the 5 cereals expressed in maize equivalents. Again, West Africa, East and Southern Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa. Let's forget about the individual countries for now. The light green color is the unrealistic scenario in which yields will not change between 2020 and 2050. So we freeze the yields. But the demand will double. Now, that leads to a self-sufficiency of less than 50%. That's quite, that makes sense, I guess. And then next to that is the dark green color. That shows the self-sufficiency if we manage to increase the yields on current areas, no further expansion, to half of the potential, 50% of yield potential under water-limited conditions. Now, that would be roughly sufficient to feed the population in Sub-Saharan Africa, half yield gap closure. So that's already quite a difference with the 80% that we concluded 10 years ago, which was barely enough. Here's some further scenarios. This is if the yields continue to increase at the same rate as they did over the past 10 years. In some countries hardly, in other countries quite a bit. But if you take the average yield increases and continue these from 2020 to 2050, then this is the second color, the trend color. And so on the intermediate green colors, I should say. Well, you can see that's not enough to achieve self-sufficiency. So there needs to be a trend change in yields, for sure. And then a third option to also continue to increase the area, as they did over the past 10 years. That's the orange color. If you take these two together, so we continue the trend of the yield changes and we continue the trend of area expansion, that would also bring us to self-sufficiency. But as indicated here, we could avoid area expansion by increasing the yields to 50% of the potential. This is all for the 5 cereals together. And I'll show you one slide in which we look at the individual cereals. Let's only look at the right part. Maize, sorghum, millet, rice and wheat. And you can see the self-sufficiency for Africa for maize, sorghum and millet is okay, or even more than that. It could export. For rice, it's okay at the moment, but we expect really a shortage of rice in the next decades. And wheat will never be self-sufficient in Africa because there are only certain regions, highlands, where wheat can really be grown well. So the situation we project is that the self-sufficiency level for wheat will be roughly the same in 2050 compared to 2020. Yeah, and what is happening in these maize equivalents that, of course, you get substitution. the surplus is compensated by deficits, or deficits compensated by surplus, etc. All right, so quickly, so how realistic are these yield levels that are needed to bring Africa to self-sufficiency in 2050? Maybe I directly jump to this one. So here are different yield levels. The current yields, the trends, so we continue of the current trend to 2050, and then the darkest green is what is needed for self-sufficiency. And then the horizontal black lines are the yield potentials under water limited conditions. So you can see in all cases, even for the individual countries, it is possible. No further area expansion is needed if the yield gap is narrowed. And there's not even necessary to have full yield gap closure, but a narrowing of the yield gap to roughly 50%, that would be sufficient. And that's at least positive news, but it will not happen automatically, of course. Important, we included effects of climate change here. So that was addressed, but I cannot promise, and I think nobody, that really the extreme events are properly accounted for. If there are extreme droughts or extreme heats, that's really difficult to handle with these modeling studies. So to summarize, the challenge for Sub-Saharan Africa, based on this most recent study, if you look at the current trends of the cereals and then aggregated, the 5 together, then this is the yield level that we observed in 2010, 2020, and if the trends would continue, we would narrow the yield gap to 30% of the potential. Well, what we need is about 50%, and I showed that in my previous slides. So we need, if you translate that to yield increases per hectare per year, currently the rate is 20, it needs to increase almost 3 times, so close to 60, from 20 to 58 kilograms per hectare per year. If that will not happen in the coming decades, then either the continent becomes more import dependent, and the question is whether they have the economic power to account for those food deficiencies, and of course they are also will be dependent and vulnerable for all kinds of geopolitical issues in the world and price volatility. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if it will not happen, these yield increases, the area expansion will continue. And that of course comes with greenhouse gas emissions, it comes with biodiversity loss, etc. From an agriculture point of view, interesting next and final questions are, okay, what does this mean for the nutrient requirements? So what kind of agronomy do we need to actually make such yield increases happening? And what is climate smart in terms of greenhouse gas emissions? Well, very briefly, in terms of agronomy, nutrients, crop nutrients in Africa are the prime factor that need to change to get higher yields. Here we calculated, again, same systematics for the regions and for the countries, how much nitrogen an average hectare of cereals needs with today's yields and the yields that continue to increase to 2050 with the current trends. And these are amounts of, let's say, a bit less than 50 kilograms or a bit more than 50 kilograms, depending on where you are. But this is what we calculate that is needed to replace what the crop is taking up. It's not what is actually given to the crop today. I will show you what the crop is given today in a minute. So the dark green color now is the yield level which is needed to achieve self-sufficiency by 2050. So that's much more. That's about 75 kilograms. Now, these are the amounts, the black vertical lines, that the crops receive today through fertilizers, which clearly is much less than what is needed. Currently, crops are under-fertilized, the soil is mined, and many are familiar with that problem in Africa, I assume. And even to maintain current yields, we would have to increase fertilizers, let alone to increase the yields to levels that are needed for self-sufficiency by 2050. almost 3 times as much. And this is worse for P and K, phosphorus and potassium. The situation and the difference between what is given now and what is needed to substitute the amounts that are taken up by the crop, that's even bigger than for nitrogen. Final slide, and then I come to my conclusions. This is all about cereals, and you may wonder, okay, but maybe the situation is more optimistic for other crops. Well, I have not seen good examples of that. Perhaps vegetables, like we import from Ethiopia, but that of course is that's a very typical market, atypical market. This is the grain legumes, all the beans and the peas and etc. that you can find. And what you have to take home from this one is again 100% self-sufficiency by 2050. That's the DEST line and the 1.0 self-sufficiency level. And you can see that 50% yield gap closure, the orange color, is not enough for the grain legumes. You need more than that, 60% or so. So it's actually more challenging for the grain legumes than for the cereals, it looks like. I conclude. Area expansion in Africa continue to be an important contributor to production increase between 2010 and 2020. Only in 10 years' time, the area has increased by at least 10% for the cereals. Interestingly, also further specialization from millet to maize that also helped to maintain self-sufficiency or even improve self-sufficiency despite this strong population increase. If we look ahead, the demand will probably double until 2050, mostly because of more people and to some extent dietary change. And given the larger baseline area, if you want, in 2020 because of this expansion, it's now relatively easier to achieve self-sufficiency in 2050 because we have that larger baseline area without further expansion. Also because the population projections are a bit less pessimistic and because we have, relatively speaking, more maize and less millet, and maize is more productive, at least if the temperatures and the growing conditions allow. So self-sufficiency could be achieved by 50% yield gap closure, which is much more realistic than the 80% that we projected 10 years ago. Yet it implies a tripling of the yield trend from 20 to roughly 60 kilograms per hectare per year. And we need a tripling of the fertilizer inputs at least to achieve that. And the question is, how do we achieve this? With very little local production of fertilizers in Africa. And all of this is assuming good agronomy. I just focused on the fertilizers, but we will need more fertilizers if the agronomy is not good. And the agronomy can be seeds, pellets, protection, the wheat and the disease management, etc. And finally, this is until 2050. A disclaimer is that it will not stop in 2050. The population is projected to increase further, maybe not doubling again. The projections are a bit less pessimistic than they used to be. But the current projections say that the population will increase from 2050 to 2100 by another 60%. So then area expansion is still likely to happen with our current knowledge. So, all right. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. And what I really like about your paper is, first, it really provides like this overview of Sub-Saharan African productivity, and second, sort of really shows sort of the cost of inaction if we don't sort of increase productivity in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is land use change and associated habitat loss and carbon emissions coming from from getting that land into agriculture. So I'm Koen, and I'll been asked to give a few reflections on Martin's paper, and I just want to give 3 takeaways. So one is about the concept of self-sufficiency. Second one is about indeed the use and producing of nitrogen fertilizers in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is at times a bit of a contentious topic. And third, to sort of look a bit at where we live, the EU, and how does this self-sufficiency relate to the EU. So first of all, self-sufficiency is good, but it's also a bit of an odd goal, in the sense that trade is generally good for sustainability, resilience, and food security. You import perhaps what you can't produce because of your agroecological conditions, and you sort of trade. To put this into perspective, with Sub-Saharan Africa and the EU, we actually import about 20 billion euros worth of agricultural products from Sub-Saharan Africa, and we export about 12 billion euros worth of agricultural products. So there's actually a net export of Sub-Saharan Africa to the EU, and that's, for example, the coffee that you drink, the chocolate that you eat, and so on. We don't produce this, but imports can also be problematic if you have a very high dependency, if there's a lot of volatility, and also you need to sell something other than than the food you import in order to have the money to buy for the imports. And there is a special kind of problematic category, and that is low-income food deficit countries. These are countries that don't produce a lot of food, but also are quite poor, so they have troubles at a macroeconomic scale to kind of produce, to pay for those imports. And if there is volatility, like we saw with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, caused problems in sort of both in the gas but also in the wheat markets. You see an uptick in price. These are the countries that immediately get into a problem. But if you look at the grand scale, local food crop production can feed about 1/3 of the population. This is just because people don't really necessarily live where food is being produced, right? Like half of the population of the world is concentrated in Southeast Asia. That region imports a lot of food. It's not necessarily a problem. And if you look at climate change adaptation, this is a paper by actually a Karel Leuven researcher. You see that through international trade, especially Sub-Saharan Africa can actually can actually reduce some of the food insecurity problems that come with increased climate change through better international trade. So this is a bit picking up on Martin's points about nitrogen fertilizer use. Sub-Saharan Africa is almost totally dependent on imports of synthetic fertilizers, and this is just showing that in 2023 nitrogen use per kilogram of hectare was about 24 kilos. The continent actually had a Abuja target that by 2015 we actually want to have about an average of 50 kilograms of nitrogen. They clearly didn't make it, but you see this is just to show about sort of the enormous increase needed in nitrogen use in the region to stop land use change, or to improve productivity and the things that come with that. Nowhere is fertilizer as expensive as in Sub-Saharan Africa, and especially in landlocked countries like Uganda. This has to do with as well that the supply chains are very fragmented, and there's a lot of intermediary people that sort of take a cut and so on. That raises the price, but at the same time that sort of leads also to an under application of fertilizers. I just also want to highlight that this obviously is part of like a wider agriculture or food system development that needs to happen, right? Nitrogen fertilizer is just one piece of a much more difficult puzzle that needs to happen, but it's definitely an important piece. Just want to show a bit. This is fertilizer production in the region in Africa, and you just see how little is being produced actually in Sub-Saharan Africa. That's North Africa above, and that's Sub-Saharan Africa. One of the ways in a project that we look at is most of the synthetic fertilizers is produced through natural gas, through a process called methane stain reforming. You can also see, and we actually visited yesterday the KU Leuven's Trans Farm, where they were producing green hydrogen. So this is hydrogen that is produced through renewable energy sources. Now it was solar that is then converted into green hydrogen. You can actually use that as a feedstock in an electrified Haber-Bosch process to then produce nitrogen fertilizers without natural gas. Why is this important? Is because not a lot of Sub-Saharan African countries have gas reserves or has gas exploitation, but they do have renewable energy potential. So they can, you know, in a way, they are very much looking into this. They are, you know, we have sun, we got wind, why don't we produce fertilizers with that instead of importing these fertilizers? And you kind of see, generally, I would say that agricultural development receives very little African elite leaders' attention. You have a few countries that are different to this. Ethiopia was mentioned, but also Rwanda. But on generally, if you look at the budgets that are allocated to the public support from an African side that is invested into agriculture, it's really many times below what actually should be, according to the own goals, like the Malabo Declaration said 10% of your government expenditure you should invest in agriculture, but also just generally what is needed to uplift the sector. But industrial development, right, and this fertilizer production can kind of put the bridge between, on the one hand, large-scale fertilizer facilities, which is industrial development, in which there is a lot of interest, but then also the link with agricultural development. This is just showing the import-export of fertilizers into Africa. You see Morocco exports a lot of fertilizer. This is phosphate, because they got 70% of the world's phosphate reserves. Egypt, sorry, perhaps I should explain this graph a bit. This is sort of import. This is then Sub-Saharan Africa, Morocco, and Egypt, and that is the export position. So you see Africa in general imports and exports actually quite a lot of fertilizers. But this is because Morocco is a big phosphate producer, exports it to the rest of the world, and Egypt does have gas reserves, makes nitrogen fertilizer of it, and then exports it. But Sub-Saharan Africa just imports it from, Russia was the biggest source of that. The last point, okay, don't look at those numbers, the bulleting, but if we look at the EU, many say the EU is the most food secure continent in the world, the most food secure region in the world. I can kind of see a lot of reasons to agree with that. We produce actually a lot of the essential staples that we consume, and we have a strong social safety net. So also on the consumption side, there's not a lot of food insecurity here. Europe generally produces. This line is 100% of EU consumption. So and these lines are what the EU produces. So we are, we produce 125% of our wheat consumption. The rest, we are net wheat exporter. So we're by far self-sufficient in wheat. We have dependence on the import of protein crops. This is, for example, soy, oil seeds like palm oil, fruit and vegetables, and bananas. And I also want to add to that natural gas. Europe is an energy-poor continent. We import natural gas, and to a large degree, we make nitrogen fertilizers of that. Now that we don't import so much gas from Russia anymore, this sector in Europe is very much into trouble. And there is very much a discussion at the EU level as well about strategic, like self-sufficiency, you can't really call it, but strategic autonomy or food sovereignty. And this is about, what are sort of our critical dependencies in terms of our food security, and how can we start to do something about that. That concept actually more comes from the raw materials, the chips and so on. rather than food, but it's also used within the food sector to push, for example, for more production of protein crops in Europe. So these were my 3 points. Self-sufficiency, yes, but, and the case for Sub-Saharan Africa to not only use more, but also produce more nitrogen fertilizers in the region, and then about, the EU is generally self-sufficient in what we produce and consume in the agricultural sector. Thank you very much.
I have a question for Martin. Very interesting presentation, thanks. You mentioned that intensification has to happen as well, but we often see that as long as expansion is still possible, then although it is well known what are all the ingredients for the intensification, farmers are not yet adopting it. They will first expand, but that means that probably the same thing is going to happen as what we did in the past centuries, that is all the forest is gone and we encroached into wetlands and whatever. So how can we stop that logic?
Shall I use this one or? Yeah, okay. Thank you for that question, Jan. Yeah, how will that happen? I think, well, there is economics. As soon as you make intensification more affordable for farmers, and cheaper fertilizers, for instance, is one thing, and knowledge and availability and etc., credit availability, that will help, but probably not enough. I think we also need active policies that protect certain areas from further expansion. So that would be my short answer. 1, make intensification affordable for farmers. 2, have an active land use policy implemented that protects certainly the fragile or the biodiversity important areas.
Thank you. Closing the yield gap was a central point in your presentation, and I guess there are many factors to help closing the yield gap, like fertilizer, genetics, biotechnology, but also management, mechanization, scaling, all the factors that are in our model of agriculture development. I guess if we just transplant our model for agriculture development to Africa, that it will be a disaster for a lot of countries. I can agree with fertilization, with genetics, with biotech, but if we go too rapid into mechanization, for example, or into scaling, I think one of the results that we see in our countries is that the number of people to produce this increased amount of food has decreased tremendously to 2 or something like % here in our countries. If this happens, if such development happens in Sub-Saharan Africa, I guess an enormous amount of people will be pushed out of agriculture. They go to the towns, they find no work, they increase the poor people of the bidonvilles, etc. I don't think it is transplanting our model that will help Sub-Saharan Africa. So perhaps the speed to increase the yield or to close the yield gap will be a bit slower than we expect from your graphs.
And thank you. And you mentioned only one, let's say, problem that may emerge if they copy what we did. There are also environmental mistakes which we made, and I don't hope anyone will copy these. So yes, I think that's a fair point. And so, I mean, to solve the problems that are there for this continent, the challenges for this continent, if you like, not only agriculture needs to change, the whole economy needs to develop, and there need to be job alternatives for the people in the rural areas. The millions of smallholders which generally have an acreage of land of 1 hectare, 2 hectares, some of you may be smallholders according to this standard, That of course, that needs to change to make the African agriculture more productive and viable. That will not happen overnight, and it requires job alternatives elsewhere in the economy and probably not only in urban areas but also in rural areas. Otherwise, that development and that upscaling and that mechanization can never happen.
Yes, but we live in another world than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
100 years ago, we could create jobs in industry and so on. But nowadays, to do that in Africa at the same speed as we did, I guess.
How fast this is possible, I don't know. Maybe Koen, as an economist, can say something. But I think the problems cannot be solved just by the agriculture sector. That's absolutely evident. Yeah.
If I can just may add to that, I think that the lack of industrial job would be the #1 fear of African leaders, or the problem that they're grappling with. But I also don't think that keeping people into agriculture, and you've got like smaller and smaller plots, might also, you know, create problems of themselves. It's very difficult to draw investments into agriculture when it's just spread out over a lot of small plots. So it's not that there is a silver bullet to it about, you know, where's the pull and where is the push, but but just keeping people into agriculture, I'm not sure if that benefits.
And on the bright side, maybe Ethiopia did manage. They have the trends that are needed for the entire subcontinent. So it shows it is possible. Yeah.
For the first speaker, I'm happy to see that you've been publishing with Godfrey and Freddie, which are my colleagues at IITA. And so, but your story is basically a story about the cereal economy in Africa. The cereal economy. Your story is a very nice story about the cereal economy in Africa. And I'm happy that you bring a second speaker, the financial dimension, into the thing. But according to IFPRI, in the next 20, 30 years, the biggest gains are coming from roots and tubers and bananas. Are you going to repeat the same story for those crops?
Yeah, if you give me the money, yes, I will do that. So, and repeating, you mean the same type of analysis for, yeah. I think there's a lack of data for these crops, but what I've seen, and I repeat what I said in my presentation, I've not seen evidence that the things for cassava or for potato or for yam or whatever, that the story will be very different. The yield gaps are a similar magnitude as for the cereals and the grain legumes, and thus the challenges will also be in the same order of magnitude. That's what I expect. And even for crops like cocoa, and the export product, the yield gaps for cocoa in Western Africa, they are tremendous, unfortunately. Yeah.
Can I have one more dimension? I just would like to have your opinion. The yield gap is yield, but you also have the crop value gap, which is a completely different story. Yeah. And that's where many crops show a completely different picture. What is your comment on that one?
Yeah, well, the extreme is maybe cereals and cocoa, in terms of value. And of course, if you would expect that if you start to commercialize, that it can be more easy to narrow yield gaps for crops like cocoa or high-value vegetables than for the main commodities like cereals or beans or cassava. That is very likely the case. Still, there are, I mean, for vegetables, I think there are good examples of small yield gaps in Africa, but these probably end up here on our plates, these products. For a crop like cocoa, well, maybe there are people in this room, but there's not many examples of plantations that have much smaller yield gaps than what you find on smallholder farms. So, yeah.
Thank you for your presentations. If the future is not that optimistic as you presented, can we expect major famines in the future?
Yeah, I could predict the future, forecast the future. I think it's definitely a risk. I mean, and that's an undertone, of course, of these studies 10 years ago and now again, that if the world does not wake up and really invests in this challenge for Africa, that will fly back in our faces sooner or later because of wars and conflicts, or because of climate change, or because of other reasons that trigger such a thing. But you may say, oh, well, this is far away, but I think we all can understand that if Africa has a problem in terms of food security, if only a fraction of the people will start to look for alternatives and come to the north, then what we have experienced so far is peanuts compared to what may happen in the future. So I think it's an issue, an ethical issue that deserves attention for the continent. People have the right to eat, to have sufficient ingredients to eat, but it's also of interest for Europe and other countries, I believe.
Thank you. With regard to the nitrogen, the term livestock has not been used in not any of your presentations. Still in our minds, livestock, crops and fertilization, they go together. So rather than investing massively in industrial development of nitrogen fertilizer production, what about the role of livestock in this?
I might be wrong, but livestock does not increase nitrogen, it just replaces it. So it recycles nitrogen. It doesn't increase the nitrogen in the system, so you need more nitrogen brought in the system. Manure is a scarce commodity in many parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's, with livestock I would rather think that you would increase genetic, like the genetic yields and so on, which are at the moment very poor, to then have climate benefits and whatnot. But in terms of nitrogen, to my understanding, what I know is that it's just insufficient to meet demand.
Yeah, so you're right, I didn't mention organic sources of nitrogen, to make it more general. And that can be manure from animals, it can be compost, or it can be also nitrogen fixation by legumes, by the way. But as to livestock, yeah, Koen gave the answer. Basically, livestock is not generating nutrients, but is rather recycling nutrients. So it will not really change the picture. And the manure that is available in Africa is used in different ways, and not always to fertilize the land, but for cooking and for plastering the houses, etc. So it is used, but it's by far not enough to meet the nutrient demands of these crops. Was there a second element to your question? I forgot, but yeah.
Last question. Thank you.
Yes, in your presentation you compared the rain-fed scenarios, and then you analyzed what nitrogen could do, but I was wondering how water management and irrigation fit into this story.
Yeah, water management is certainly important in the sense that the water that is there and falls from precipitation and can be captured in the soils or kept in the soil. You need the right management in terms of tillage and water conservation, etc., to realize the potentials that I showed. So it's assuming good water management. If your question is about irrigation, so to add extra water to the system, I think for the crops that I showed, this is fairly small, the contribution. There are areas in Africa which have still possibilities for irrigation expansion. But I expect that will probably be used, well, for rice maybe, irrigated rice, but also for vegetables and other higher value crops. But Africa is different compared to Asia in the sense that the share of irrigation will always be small.
Okay, thank you very much. We are already a little bit over time. It was a very, very interesting introduction. We learned a lot. Thank you for your attention. So, see you.